What's up, everybody? I'm Alex with Slow Your Roll, and today we're going to be talking about another homebrew review. If you've ever had trouble building out the world lore with your very combat-oriented party, this might be that tool. Or if you just don't know how to build a dungeon to make it interesting and last in your players' memories, then this might be the key you're looking for. Because today, we're going to be talking about dungeon cores. A sentient dungeon throughout your world, and it opens up a whole can of worms, I swear. There's always going to be a PDF down below, so go ahead and check that out. But I do want to say that this is by no means my idea. The dungeon core genre is budding in the literary RPG or progression fantasy. If you want any examples of books you could check out, please check out some of these or these over here. Let's talk about it. Why the heck would you want a sentient dungeon? And what does that really do for world building? So when it comes to world building, depending on how early on your world really is, it could be like the seeding of a whole new planet. A dungeon core makes monsters to defend its dungeon, but if a dungeon is left unattended for too long, its inhabitants are able to wander the earth. So this could be how you explain why there's monsters everywhere, other than a funky type of evolution that gave you dragons from dinosaurs. And there are a couple of different ways that dungeon cores can be created, so you can put them all over your world. The bottom line of how a dungeon core gets created is it's a massive influx of power crystallized to be a sentient being. This can be done through natural phenomenon, a divine presence, or maybe even through some kind of ritualistic origin. So the key word here is sentient dungeon. A dungeon core controls the things in the dungeon, like the room layout, what's in the dungeon, and the type of loot that you're able to get for completing it. Or even a more cool mechanic, bargaining for different types of boons or specific upgrades that you could ask for the DM. It could be a really interesting way for you to ask your players what they want without asking your players what they want. Now this is like a living, breathing creature. Maybe not breathing. It's got goals and a personality. And general goals for a dungeon would be things like survival, making sure that nobody finds the dungeon core to destroy it, expanding its territory and influence. The size of the dungeon core could really be infinite. You could have things like a cave, a dungeon, big strongholds underground, or the whole pans or labyrinth. And funny enough, that's the 4 different tiers of play I outlined for in this PDF. So hopefully I've sold the concept to you for now, but how exactly is a dungeon core created? A deity would be able to a dungeon core into existence easy enough and place it wherever they'd like in the ground, on a tree, or wherever. There could be a comet or meteor coming down and hitting the earth with a massive amount of power. It would normally create some other things like glass, crystals, and stuff like that. But in this magical world, it creates a dungeon core as well because of a crystallization of power. Next up, we've got the tectonic plates shifting. This massive smashing of the earth together would probably be able to create a dungeon core. And lastly, a hero or villain of massive importance or power sacrificing themselves to create a core. And this is a self-inflicted ritual of sacrifice. You're literally removing your spirit from your body and condensing your life force, whatever's left of your body, into the crystal, turning their body into the dungeon core, re-inhabiting it with their spirit. So there's a couple of different ways that they would be scattered all over the planet, and the way that they grow and progress is absorbing the material that's directly adjacent to them when they were made. So if it's placed within a tree, it's going to start absorbing that different kinds of nature energy or whatever dies within its field of influence. Likewise, non-organic material is essentially dead and able to be shifted and formed. So dirt, ores, stone, other things like that can be manipulated by the dungeon, which is why they're able to easily make caves for things to explore within. And when it gets to organic material, they need to steal that life force. It's the whole point of the dungeon. It's supposed to have things die in the dungeon, and it'll essentially get that blueprint of life. So if like a kobold or something wanders into the dungeon and is smashed by a rock trap, then it now has the blueprint for kobolds and can make and reproduce those. And the more things that die within the dungeon, the more resources it has to make other things. It's essentially expanding its knowledge every single time something enters the dungeon. The dungeon grows, so does its intelligence and forces within the several rooms that it's likely to have created. So the theme is almost environmentally dependent, but that's where the method of creation comes in to give it that little bit of a tweak. If it was created by some divine entity, it would probably have those goals and morals of the divine entity, which kind of leads into what's the alignment of the dungeon. I just mean, is it lawful? Is it neutral? Is it chaotic? Keep it simple. It doesn't have to be good, bad, or ugly. But it could give you like the methods and motives behind what this dungeon wants, more so than just expansion. And in the exact same vein, if this dungeon was made through ritualistic means, it likely had goals and memories from its past life that you'd more than easily be able to incorporate into the theme or even quest of the dungeon. Since there's so many different dungeon cores scattered all across the world, that really leads into a territory war. What kind of dungeon is here and how far does it expand? Dungeons, more or less, being a renewable resource for going in there and grabbing the ore and then it regenerates in a couple of days, or the grass and fauna just regenerates overnight after you've cut it. Killing the werewolves and other things in there provides pelts and meats daily. It could be an excellent source of resources and income for a newly budding kingdom or society. Fully nurturing a dungeon could essentially be the key to success in your world. There could be a dungeon at the center of each gigantic city kept in line by the guardian of this city. Introducing a whole new power dynamic that's not just, this is a big city, a lot of people can overpower us. The guy that's keeping the dungeon in line is gonna keep me in line too. But when it does come to territory wars and other things like that, it's a awesome world building tool if it's divine creation of dungeons. If all of your dungeons, for some reason, are divinely created, that's literally a territory war for the influence over the world in your D&D game. All of these dungeon cores could essentially be a beacon for followers and essentially a measure of how much energy one deity has compared to another. It could be more than just a symbolic victory over peace. The war god could literally have extinguished every one of the god of peace's dungeon cores, and now that god and religion is destitute. Left without power, clerics no longer able to perform. That did get a little bit dark there. Let's move on to how you're going to be able to talk to your new buddy, the dungeon. Most of the time, getting contact to the dungeon core is going to be an outlandish goal to achieve by most adventurers. But being able to talk to and bargain with the dungeon is likely going to be one of the ways it expands its knowledge and influence. If you are going to go up to the dungeon core and be like, hey buddy, I have this rare material that you've never had before, and I'll let you have it as long as you give me something, you might just be on the right line of the thinking for the dungeon. They want something new, shiny, special, something they haven't seen before. It's basically a black hole of knowledge. And if you've got it, it wants it. And it could probably give you a couple of different magical items made on the spot. So long as it's absorbed something like a sword before and it knows how stones work, maybe you could get a +2 stone skin sword. Things like that. And it's really where the dungeon shines. If a kobold walks into the dungeon and it has, let's say, a lava affinity because that's where the core was next to, you now have like lava kobolds, or like they have crackles all over their body where they're like elementally infused because the dungeon has the blueprint of lava, it has the blueprint of kobolds. Smash them together to make something cool. And that's really where the thematic advantage of having a sentient dungeon core controlling a dungeon comes from. There's a reason why things are the way that they are, even if they're a little bit weird, especially if they're a little bit weird. This can help you to expand those kind of dungeon ideas that's like, wait, a shadow dungeon? A dungeon of time? A dungeon of like underwater SpongeBob Sea adventure, who knows? It's up to you. But it's because the dungeon has a will and mind of its own that it's able to create and accomplish different things that are a little bit unorthodox. So we've talked about it being able to essentially create and recreate any item or thing that's died within the dungeon. But the boon system is so much more important. What if a person pledges themselves to the dungeon, letting it take a blueprint of them, and it'll be able to give them a boon in return? So like that +2 stone skin that we were talking about, or perhaps it has that like lava affinity, and now you also have a resistance to fire. You're also crackling that the kobolds were doing earlier. But because it has the blueprint of your life, it's able to alter it in a way. And there are so many different implications to that I think you DMs could go wild with. Imagine coming back to the dungeon next time and they have to fight themselves. As we say, it has the blueprint of life as long as whatever died within it is within it. And what if your buddy Kevin died while you were adventuring through this dungeon and you had to bargain with the dungeon to get Kevin back? And now it has a blueprint of your body, or you just happen to lose this rare material like, oh no, I had this diamond. You probably already used the diamond for resurrection, but oh no, I had this diamond, and now the dungeon has the diamond and it's able to make diamond-clad golems or something like that. But that's if you get to talk to the dungeon, which not a lot of people will get to do. It's got to be something that's really hard for the dungeon to want to talk to you, or it's got to be a part of the quest in a way. Normal people are just going to go through a dungeon thinking it's a random dungeon and not even ever think about or see the core. And that's why there's a normal reward system in place. It could be honestly as corny as there being a chest at the end of the dungeon and here's your loot. But it's super easy to have whatever loot that you were going to give to your parties on the bodies that they killed throughout the way. And to land on that one more time, there's a bunch of different secondary objectives that you could put within dungeons to just give that little bit of oomph for loot. Like, let's just say they found and rescued a hostage in a secret room. That secret room has something cool in it for them to take home with them too. And maybe a reward for the hostage when they find their way home. Now, I don't really like puzzles, more or less, but a puzzle that's not how you progress in the dungeon, but leads you to secret rooms or hidden treasures, sounds awesome. If your party is honestly smart enough to be able to find Leonidas's lost throne, then let them do it. Leave them the breadcrumbs, but that's not the main course. We've talked a whole lot about what the heck the dungeon can do, but let's talk about what it can't do. The dungeon core itself, it's an object that doesn't really have any mobility. It might be able to create constructs to carry it around, but for the most part, you might find it hidden away throughout the dungeon in a secret room, or even having a decoy dungeon core. If people wanted to talk to the dungeon core and destroy it, they wouldn't die entirely. Another downfall of just being a dungeon core in general is the availability of resources. It's not going to be very likely that sand is going to come blowing in if you're not near a desert or shore. It's not going to be likely that you get, let's say, a pocket of lava unless you're deep, deep down into the world, or by a volcano. So essentially being diplomatically isolated could give you the upper hand when you're negotiating with dungeons. There's no way he's got iron in the forest, right? And another thing to make it so that dungeons aren't this all-encompassing force that squash your party when you get into the room, they cannot control the dungeon after foreign entities have entered it. Once your adventuring party enters into the dungeon core is hands-off. They're left to be the planners, strategists, and anyone else trying to think ahead. They've got traps, they've got monsters to do their bidding, and it's likely most people will never even interact with the dungeon core. So the focus is absolutely on the dungeon. But the more powerful dungeon cores might be able to control room to room. So maybe it can't squash the room that your adventurers are currently in, but the next room is definitely changed because they just obliterated the first room. And sometimes that would probably just happen for a DM anyway. You're recreating things because, wow, these players are really running through it. So you added a couple more monsters in. But now there's a justification for that in the world. the DM's not the only one watching. I think I already covered the incentives to keep dungeon cores, because they could truthfully influence the environment and ecosystem all around the dungeon, not just from wild monsters, but if a city was relying on the resources coming from a dungeon, that would essentially be like dooming that city. But in the exact same vein of things, if you were to go around stealing and destroying dungeon cores, there'd be so much different kind of political instability and espionage that you'd be able to pull off in your games. So having dungeon cores isn't just about the boom, boom, shoot 'em up. You could totally have it be all about political intrigue if you've got the role players around the table. And I think dungeon cores would still fit in perfectly fine. I did mention stealing a core, not just destroying one. If you steal a dungeon core, you can imagine that's a priceless artifact. Kingdoms would likely pay unheard of amounts for it. But understand that giving away dungeon cores is a massive power balance that you're essentially altering now. It's basically like your Hashirama giving away the tailed beasts now. But some of the implications for actually destroying a dungeon could be that could lead to the loss of power or following of a deity, a massive ecological impact. The monsters all around the dungeon that could have been spilling out of the dungeon will die if they were the first generation of monster to be created by the dungeon. And I'm using the term monster loosely. They could be constructs, or they could just be little bunnies with horns. But that ecological impact would be pretty expansive if it was a large dungeon that had miles of territory. And when you think about it, in the larger dungeons that are probably able to summon things like dragons that have died within their domain, probably a pretty big territory. There would also probably be divine retribution if you happen to take out a god's temple, especially if it's not their last one, they're coming for you. But one thing that would be left over is the offspring of creatures created from the dungeon. As long as you're one generation removed from the initial creation from the dungeon, you should still be around when the dungeon explodes. Now let's actually talk about destroying the dungeon, because it's going to be a skill challenge to be able to destroy the dungeon. You're going to need 3 successes before you get 3 failures, and yes, it is supposed to be difficult to destroy a dungeon. But it doesn't have to be specifically destroying it in your hands because you're super beefy. There's different things that you could do, like strength, athletics to break through the hardened shell, or wisdom, perception to find the core's weak point. There's intelligence, arcana to disrupt its magic flow to make it explode. Whatever that your players could reasonably argue to use against the dungeon core sounds good to me. If they think they can destroy it by putting it right next to their saxophone and blowing real hard, then if they get a good check, maybe those vibrations are magic this time. So I pretty much covered most of the things a part of dungeons and how they could really flesh out your world. I have a progression system for dungeon cores from cave, dungeon, stronghold, and labyrinth, and a decent description of what they're capable of, so that way it's easy for you to build out your dungeon. So I've got the different tiers of play laid out for you, and even a dungeon core creation template. Just to give you a quick example, you're going to want to think of things like its origin, whether it be natural, divine, or a ritual. It could have a personality. What's its goals, desires, and the description of the core? Is it just a crystal that pulsates with a little white light? Or is it now an orb that has this black aura around it? It's almost a black hole. Just make sure to get creative with it. There could be a bunch of different abilities that the core has, usually derived from whatever's around it, its knowledge that it's gained, or what it started with as a ritual or divine seeding. The layout of the dungeon, general rooms are gonna be assumed, so you're gonna have like corridors, traps, treasure rooms, and other things like that. But try to think of a room or two that's unique to this dungeon, something that's like memorable and only this dungeon has. Kind of like a skylight that eventually when the sun comes up, it turns into this big magnifying glass that burns anyone who's in the room. Try to think of the different monsters in the dungeon, and that could just be influenced by the wildlife in the area. Could a firefly flown in and now there's a bunch of different fireflies that actually create fires? Or is it just like you got a bunny, you got a bear, and you're able to transform them in different ways to match the theme of the dungeon? your iron scale owlbear, or maybe a serpent snake that goes into the river and just blends right in with the water because of its pearlescent scales. Try to think of different cultural impacts for your dungeon core. Is there a city that relies on it, or is there an ecosystem that's now budding because of it? Different kinds of adventure hooks that could be a part of your dungeon. They don't have to directly influence the dungeon core. They could just be taking a scholar through the dungeon because they want to know what it's like to be a dungeon delver. And try to think of some consequences for destroying the dungeon core. It could mess up an economy, an ecology, or maybe you end up making somebody much more powerful very mad. And at the end, try to think of rewards that can be left all throughout the dungeon. The different side quests and loot that's a part of your dungeon could be really cool, especially if it's thematically accurate to whatever you're creating. It would be nice to go to the lava dungeon and get a lava ring, so that way whenever you punch somebody, a little bit of lava comes out. I don't know how I'd make that mechanically, but that sounds cool. But really, I think that's everything that I can think of when it comes to a dungeon core. I have 4 different examples of the different tiers of dungeons if you want to check them out in the PDF. And if you have any ideas or any bases that I have not covered for a dungeon core, leave it down below. I do just want to say one more time, please check out some of the dungeon core fantasies. You might be able to find them on Audible. You could totally check out the Dungeon Core series, Shadowcroft Academy, or my personal favorite, Dungeonborn by Dakota Kraut. And I haven't really seen any dungeon cores on the TTRPG landscape yet, so I figured I might as well do it. But hey, if you like that video and you got any more ideas on how we can expand the dungeon core concept, leave them down below. But until next time, everybody, I'll see you all later.